Hello, welcome to lecture number 1. I'm Catherine Creech, and we are going to be talking about an introduction to evolution. So I start us with a picture of some finches. These are Galapagos finches. Their genus name is Geospiza, and numbers 1, 2, and 3, you can see over their head, are all the same genus. They're all those Galapagos finches, but they have really different size beaks, and those beaks are used for different things like cracking nuts or eating fruit or eating bugs. So the type of food the beak is used for determines its shape. Like if you're going to crack nuts, it needs to be stronger and bigger than if you're going to eat ants, it needs to be smaller and daintier. So I like this image because it points out that the form of the structure relates to its function, which is something we'll talk about throughout the term. And it highlights what evolution is, which is just change over time. So the bottom right corner, bird number 4, that's actually a different species, a different genus that you can use for comparison. I do want to take a moment to talk about the difference between evolution and science and religion, because I know a lot of you have these deep, strong personal belief systems, and I don't want you to feel like what you're learning in this class is in opposition to what you personally believe. Religion's really good for you. It lowers your blood pressure. It's a sense of community. Like we have all this evidence to suggest that having a religion, just like owning a pet, is good for your overall health. So please do not feel like I'm judging your religion. I don't think that religion and science are antagonistic. I totally think they can go together. And if you feel resistant or judged at all during this, please feel free to reach out to me and we can talk about it. But know that I'm down with whatever your religion is, and I'm not trying to change any of your religious beliefs. I do think it's really important to talk about the processes on Earth as we understand them. And we have a lot of really good data to suggest that evolution is a thing, which is why we call it the theory of evolution. Because in biology, a theory is something that is well supported with a lot of data, just like the theory of gravity. So we will talk about the data that supports this process. And if it helps you think about it a little better, every time I say evolution, just think change over time. That's all it is just change over time. Excuse me. So let's start with this picture here. This picture represents a lot of misconceptions of evolution. The first misconception is that it looks like humans evolved from that ape, and that is not true. And a lot of people have a problem with that idea that people evolved from apes. So good news for you, it's not true. What is true is that apes and humans had a common ancestor historically. So we both evolved from something that no longer exists, but you did not come from a gorilla as we know gorillas. Another thing that this image kind of represents is an improvement over time. You go from something smaller, an animal, less complex, and it's a progression toward advancements, intelligence, like getting better, improvements, and that's not necessarily true either. Evolution isn't an intentional increase in getting better or more complex. In fact, some organisms evolve to be more simplistic and more basic. Evolution just means change over time. It doesn't have to be good change, it just is change. This image also makes it look like it's a linear progression, like there's a path to follow it, and all you do is just keep walking on it. And that's not true either, because evolution is not planned, it just happens. Changes happen based on genetic variation, and some of those genes get passed on to the next generation and some of them don't. The last thing that I hope you noticed about this is that the human is evolving to be whiter. That's white supremacy in action, and we need to call it out when we see it There's no reason that it needed to be added to this image. So trying to train ourselves to be aware so that we can edit these mistakes. It's not necessary. When we talk about evolution, we often think about Darwin. And you know from your reading that there are two different people that discovered the idea of natural selection. So evolutions change over time. Natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. It's how it works. We'll talk more about it, don't worry. And when we talk about evolution, we only really talk about Darwin because he's the person who gets the most credit, even though he wasn't the only person to come up with this idea. And he gets the most credit because he was rich and well-educated and well-connected. So that mattered. And so there's kind of a debate happening right now with biologists about whether or not we want to remove the focus from Darwin because some of his writing and opinions are problematic. But he also had some really strong, good opinions too. So I'm going to let you decide your own opinion about Darwin, and I'm going to give you the data. So here's the things in favor of Darwin. He was a loud, vocal opponent to slavery. He hated the practice. He thought it was an abomination, and it is. So he was really against slavery. Good job, Darwin. He also advocated the idea that all humans, regardless of race, are closely related, which really upset slave-using countries like the United States of America. The United States was justifying slavery, saying that it was the natural order of things. But if you recognize that we're all one species, we're all really closely related, it doesn't hold up. It makes no sense. So his book on the origin of the species was actually pretty controversial politically because it highlighted the idea that we're enslaving ourselves. And that made a lot of people upset. Darwin was also unaware of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is the practice of expecting people to be able to make their lives better with effort. So there's a phrase for this, it's pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Another term is meritocracy. So you get what you work for. And if you're not rich or if you're not successful, the only reason is that you're not trying. And we know that that's not true. It's not like people are in poverty because they're not trying. People are in poverty because we have this capitalistic society that's set up to keep some people in poverty. So Darwin didn't know about any of that. His name got attached to it. It was not his intent. But Darwin does have some problematic ideas too. He's totally misogynistic. He thinks that men are superior, smarter, just better in general than women. And many people thought that back in the day, and maybe now. He also had a cousin who founded the eugenics movement. Eugenics is the idea that you can breed better children by choosing who has kids together. It was popularized by Hitler during the Nazi movement. He came up with his idea of the Aryan race, and he wanted to create a better race by it. And as soon as you start talking about breeding better people, it becomes racist really quickly. And so eugenics doesn't work well in practice at all. Like it's something that we stay away from because who's to say what better is? It's almost always problematic. But that was his cousin. That wasn't him, except that he subscribed to the idea. He wrote, Darwin himself wrote, "The civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world." I do like the idea that you're seeing both sides of a person because humans aren't all bad or all good. We're usually a mix of both. And you get to make up your own mind about whether or not You think Darwin is someone that should continually be represented in our books as like the greatest scientist because he often is represented that way. He also has a lot of writing that's not related to biology. This is my favorite one. I know it's really hard to read, but this is Darwin's pro and con list about whether or not to get married. In the top, it says, this is the question. And then on one side, it says marry. And on the other side, it says not marry. This is what it says. Go ahead and pause it and read it. So kind of a hoot. Reasons to get married. It's better than a dog. Female chit chat. Reasons against. Less money for books. Having to visit relatives. So that always cracks me up. He ended up deciding that he would get married, and he married his first cousin, Emma. He had 10 kids with Emma. A lot of his kids were kind of sickly, and he used his own children as evidence that inbreeding produces inferior offspring. So thanks for that, Darwin. Now let's move on to a little bit more about how evolution works in practice. Take a look at these 4 different pictures. There's an animal hidden in each one. So go ahead and pause it and find each animal. Up in the top left, we have that owl. Right in the center, its eyes are closed. On the top right, you have a furry caterpillar. The yellow line down the center is the line of its back. In the bottom left, you have an orchid mantis. So it's a praying mantis that looks just like an orchid flower. And on the bottom right, there is a lizard. I think that one's the hardest one to see, but can you see its yellow eyeball and its fat tail? These images highlight how natural selection occurs. Because why do these animals look like this? How did that owl and that caterpillar and that praying mantis become perfectly suited for their environments? Because if I were to pick up that praying mantis and put it right next to the owl would see it in a second. It would stand out like crazy in a different environment. The mechanism that caused this to happen is natural selection, and it occurs like this. On the left, we have a cartoon of 3 birds eating. So at the top, you see that there is a table full of bugs. There's mostly green bugs, and then there's a couple of orange bugs. And each of the 3 birds has grabbed a green bug and says, "Yum, green bugs are a favorite." So they eat that bug, then they go in for another bug, and we know that they prefer green bugs. So they take another green bug, and the population on the table in the center column is now about 50% orange, 50% green. If the birds, like they do in the last row, keep eating the green bugs, they're going to decrease the green genes in the pool, in your population, which is going to leave more orange genes. So over time, your population is going to go from mostly green bugs to mostly orange bugs. That's natural selection. And that's what happened with those 4 really camouflaged animals. The little mantis that looked like an orchid, if it was a different color, it would be easier to see, it would be easier to eat. Same thing for that little fuzzy caterpillar. If it didn't match that leaf, a predator would see it, a predator would eat it, and it wouldn't pass on its genes. So the little fuzzy caterpillar that fit in best with the environment was more likely to survive. And if you're surviving, you can produce your own offspring. And if you produce offspring, you pass your genes on to the next generation. So it made more fuzzy little green caterpillars that look like leaves. The ones that didn't look like leaves were eaten and their genes are gone. Just like these green bugs here are being eaten and those genes are being removed from your population. Another example, which we see on the right, is giraffes. So the original idea about how giraffes got that really long neck was popularized by a guy named Lamarck. And what he thought was, as giraffes reached for leaves, their body remembered the movement of stretching, right? Like it thought about stretching for the leaves, and that caused their kids to have longer necks. So then the kids stretched for leaves, and their body remembered it, and they had longer necks. Turns out that's not how it works. I mean, it sounds intuitive because their necks got longer, right? But you can't pass on traits that you don't have genes for. So instead, the way this works is the giraffes with the longer necks, like those two seen in the first image, they got the leaves, and so they survived. The other two giraffes with shorter necks, they could not reach the leaves, so they did not survive. So now the genes for longer necks exist in the population, where the other genes are falling out of the population. If long-necked giraffes mate with other long-necked giraffes and they produce long-necked giraffes, that will keep the long neck in your group. Over time, the short-necked giraffes all kind of died out. And so you're left with this one phenotype, the long neck. There's a difference between acquired traits and heritable traits. So you have to be able to inherit it from your parents for it to be passed on to the next generation. So as much as I stretch my neck and think about it, I'm not going to be able to make my kid have a longer neck unless I have the gene for it. That brings us to a new idea. Evolutionary fitness is basically equal to how much you contribute to the gene pool of the next generation. That means that the Duggards, which are the family in that photo, and the reality show 19 Kids and Counting, which I think there's a spinoff now that's still going, they are very fit. They have a high evolutionary fitness score because their genes are overrepresented in the next generation. They have 19 kids, and those kids had 20 grandkids, so their genes are being passed on at a high rate. That is very evolutionarily fit. I, on the other hand, have an evolutionary fitness score of 0. I am an evolutionary dead end, and I will not pass on any genes to the next generation. So my score is none. Evolution biology no longer includes me. We have a vocab word for this. It's fecundity. It's how many offspring you can produce at a given time. So high fecundity means lots of offspring. Like seahorses can have hundreds to thousands of offspring at once. Humans can have like 6. So we have generally lower fecundity, but we do have a long reproductive period from like 13 to 40 roughly. So it's a long time. You can produce a lot of kids, like 19 of them. In your book, you read about the different evidences that we have to support evolution. I bring it up again because I want to talk about the first one. The first one is the most interesting to me. Like, yeah, there's fossils, yeah, there's shared characteristics, embryology, biogeography. You've seen that in your book. The direct observation is really interesting. Here's an example of direct observation. I know there's a lot of big words on this one. Overall trend since the 1980s, 1981, 1989, the rate of antibiotic resistance in different bacteria has been increasing. And this is an example of evolution in action because the 1980s was when we introduced antibiotics and antiseptics. So if you're in a hospital and you wipe down a surface and you look at your little Lysol pack and it says it kills 99.9% of bacteria, when you wipe that surface and you kill 99.9%, you leave 0.1%. that 0.1% was not killed by the antibiotic, so it's resistant to it. And now it has a nice clean environment where it can grow and grow and grow and grow. And in the new population of bacteria, most of them are going to be antibiotic resistant because that was all that was left in the gene pool after you used your little wipe. Since they're no longer the same as the original group, it counts as evolution. It changed over time. Something else that I want to mention, divergent evolution is getting different body forms from the same basic body plan. We also call these homologous structures. So divergent evolution produces homologous structures. And in this, you can see that all these mammals, human, cat, whale, bat, all those creatures have basically the same body plan. One bone, two bones, your wrist bones, your hand bones, your finger bones. It's one, two, many. Even though the use is totally different. Like I don't really swim or fly with this as much as I try to do both. Instead, I grip things, and my kitty cat, her front paw has basically the same bones in the same organization, except she walks on it instead of grips things with it. So I really like that. And then the follow-up, the other side of divergent evolution is convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is two things that are not closely related, looking similar based on their environments. So on the top here, we have a dolphin and a whale. They both have streamlined bodies. They both have a dorsal fin. They both have front flippers. They both have a tail. They swim using their muscular tail. But one's a mammal and one's a fish. So they look similar, but they don't look similar because they're closely related. They look similar because they live in similar environments. On the bottom, you have a euphorb and a cactus. They both look like cactuses, except one's a euphorb, and they're not closely related, but they're both desert plants. So the little spikes on the euphorb and the cactus are actually modified leaves. Leaves are where your plant loses moisture. And so if you live in a really hot environment, really hot and dry like the desert, if you can reduce your leaf, if you can make it smaller, then you won't lose as much water and you can exist better. So both euphorbs and cactuses use the same body form, but they're not closely related. And then the last thing I want to talk about in lecture is natural selection versus artificial selection. Natural selection is the process of some organisms surviving in an environment better, and that produces change over time. As the environment changes, certain organisms will exist better, they'll fit better. Other organisms will not be as fit. Remember, fitness is being able to produce new offspring. And then artificial selection is not related to the environment. It's usually done by humans or something that's cultivating another organism, like ants grow fungus. So they artificially select what kind of fungus they're growing. But the example we love is dogs. Like that adorable little teacup chihuahua right there, it was not selected because it fit into the environment best. It was selected by us because we thought it was cute. So we artificially chose who succeeded in our breeding programs of dogs, and that's what gave us our different dog breeds. Note that even though the wolf is Canis lupus, the domestic dog is a subspecies of the wolf. So they're closely related still, but their body forms are totally different. What is a good word to describe that? It might have been something we just talked about. If you said divergent evolution, you are correct. All right, that is your first lecture. Thank you so much for watching, and email me with questions. I'm excited to talk about it. Our next lecture is going to be about the mechanisms of evolution. So see you then.